Okay, so unfortunately, I prepared not to speak 30 minutes, but my purpose was that there will be time and room for questions and comments in between, not by Q&A or chat, but the panelists can unmute themselves and interrupt with questions and comments. And in the end, I hope there is time left for questions also. I hope that let's do it as an experiment. It makes things more lively. So let us try it that way. Just if you have a question you think is relevant for the audience, I encourage you to interrupt me. So with that understood, this is a lecture about the history of risk theory and prospect theory. The perspective will be completely descriptive, nothing normative, only let the data speak. I will tell the history of how decision under risk developed into prospect theory, but I have something in mind, and I will tell it in such a way that it is related to the current and probably the future state of the decision under ambiguity. So I hope that things that did not go very well in the history of risk, that specialists of ambiguity can recognize how we can learn from that. I must say I'm not an objective outsider. There are some theories that I like more, and I will not be very neutral in this, I guess. Now there's something not working very well yet. Okay, there are two topics that I will organize my lecture about. The first is the general question, how can we model risk attitude in particular? Is it how people feel about outcomes, functions operating on outcomes, that will be utility functions, or should we do something with probabilities, how people feel about probabilities and then functions on them, probability weighting. Which of these is to what extent useful to capture risk attitude descriptively? That's one question I will keep on discussing. And in one line, there's a second line. I will be jumping between two lines, hope it's no problem. That is not the general way to model, but the particular phenomena that we want to capture. Do we think, in particular, I will focus on the question, do we believe that risk aversion is a universal phenomenon, modulo noise? Or do we believe that there are so many violations that is so systematic that we should incorporate risk seeking sometimes? That's the second question. The history, how that developed, I will discuss. And I guess that the experts in ambiguity recognize relevance for what's going on in ambiguity today. Nowadays, there are models on ambiguity that operate, mostly get the thing from functions on outcomes. The smooth model is the most famous one. Your ambiguity averse, if your outcome function phi of u is concave. But other models are more event or probability oriented, like multiple priors and ring dependent. So that's a debate in the ambiguity literature. And I think the history of risk can shed light on that. And also, is risk aversion universal? Is ambiguity aversion universal? The same kind of discussion. Again, we can learn from history there. So that understood. I will start with the general question, how to model risk attitude. And we all know the classic expected utility theory. We've seen this theorem, risk aversion, if known, if utility concave, we have nice indexes, but all these things, risk attitude is captured through the utility function. So it's outcome oriented, a function operating on outcomes. That's the classical model, normative, descriptive. Today I talk descriptive. Now, from the beginning, psychologists have objected to that. From the beginning, when psychologists saw this, alarm bells went off in their mind, and they said, this is weird. They said, a utility function is how you feel about money, how you feel about outcomes. That surely cannot be all of risk attitude. How happy you are when you get an outcome, that's a different part of your brain than how you feel about risk. How you feel about risk, that is how you feel about probabilities. We think that's a weird thing of expected utility not to have that. Usually economists are less open to such ways of reasoning, unfounded about processes. Economists are tougher. They want observable, revealed preferences, and if you can prove mathematically risk aversion, if and only if utility concave, then that's end of discussion. So economists don't like much such unfounded reasoning maybe. But I think here the input of psychology was important. And for the field to be where it is today in a good state, it was really needed that psychologists were always pushing this idea and kept on advancing it, as I hope the rest will show of this lecture. So psychologists from the beginning said, we want a theory that captures how people feel about probabilities, Then it's very natural if you put up a formula that your economists, they are transforming money amounts non-linearly to capture deviation from expected value. Psychologists will do the same with probabilities. And then it's very natural to use the formula that we see here. But nowadays, everybody knows it doesn't really work well, but at first people were not aware of it. And it's very plausible to try this. So psychologists were quite working with this formula from the beginning. In some natural conditions of that probability weighting function. And there was the psychologist Lola Lopez. She wrote eloquently about these things. She wrote, for instance, she said, risk attitude is more than the psychophysics of money. Psychophysics that, for instance, they study if you put a drop of cold water on your skin, how much coldness do you feel? Psychophysics, they study what kind of sensations you get from stimuli. And then utility, how much, if you get $1, how much happiness do you feel in your heart? So utility is just the psychophysics of money. And Lola Lopez said risk attitude must be more than that. This was 87, but already since the 1950s, psychologists were arguing that way. In fact, the argument that probability weighting is interesting has been argued much older. There's a citation, we will not read it all, but there's a very old citation already arguing that probability transformation is interesting. In 1982, Paul Shoemaker wrote a paper in Journal of Economic Literature, and also with enthusiasm, he wrote in that spirit, it cannot be that risk attitude is a utility function through outcomes. This doesn't make sense. And he convinced in the 1980s, many people in the field in economics were convinced of that point. It's not homeomorphic, you could say. It doesn't fit the psychology of human beings. And there have been many psychologists from the beginning working with such models that try to do things with probabilities. And well, they were using the formula, we now know it's a bad one. Ward Edwards had many papers on it. But strangely enough, those theories never became very big. We know now because there were some problems, but it was a bit strange. A good intuition, why don't people do much with it? So that was the general question, how to model risk attitude. I will continue later with it. Now I go to the second line of my lecture, not how in general you model, but what kind of particular phenomena did you want to incorporate? So should we assume universal risk aversion to be universal, or are there too big deviations from it? We'll discuss the history of that question. And economists usually like concave utility. Well, they assume expected utility, then it's the same as risk aversion. And they would use arguments until 30 years ago, like diminishing modern utility makes sense. Every extra dollar give less than the one before. And it's very convenient for all kind of things like existence of equilibria. So economists quite like to assume concave utility and therefore risk aversion as a universal phenomenon. You may notice that the arguments, this was 30 years ago, experimental economics became big, then it became better. Before that, economics was quite armchair, not very, actually at the micro level, not looking much at data. So this was going on. There was a problem that people acknowledged, the existence of lotteries, the coexistence of lottery and insurance, you cannot really explain. And people acknowledged it as a problem, they didn't know what to do, but said, okay, such is life, you never have a perfect model. I'm afraid I have to say that more often today, to come later. Anyway, people still live with it. Now I'll go back to the first line, how in general should we model risk attitude? That question, how did that progress in history? In the end of the 1970s, there was renewed interest. So before in the 50s, psychologists were already working, economists not so much interested. But in the 1970s, there was more interest in economics, because economists started to get more interest in deviation from expected utility, and then probability weighting is a very natural way to do it. Machina 82 wrote an influential paper, make people more interested in deviations in non-EU. And of course, we all know the Allais paradox, a very great idea of Allais that brought about so much. But maybe there was much attention for Allais paradox, but in a way, maybe it was too much attention in Allais paradox. Maybe a few of us who were around in the 1980s in conferences in the field, that there were many papers, many models deviating from expected utility were introduced. They all were just trying to accommodate the Allais paradox. Theoretical people, they don't study much the empirical findings. There was a bit of a disconnect between empirical and theoretical papers. Many theories, and always they try to explain, if you're in a conference, a new lecture comes and you say, you know, oh no, not another explanation of a lake paradox. It was maybe a bit too much. There was a whole flurry of non-expected utility models. And maybe we spoke earlier this conference about what we can learn from biologists. Maybe biology, they call such a state when there's something new and many diverse variations, life form come, they call that adaptive radiation. Usually after that comes a stage whereby selection and over time, many of these forms disappear and competition comes in. And I assume that in this history that people working on ambiguity may recognize the situation a bit. In ambiguity, I think maybe there was too much, in the 80s, people were too much focused on the lake paradox. I think nowadays, people are too much focused on Ellsberg paradox. There are many other, it's one of the greatest ideas in the field, opening up ambiguity. But I think it's not very representative for what really happens with ambiguity with natural events. People are too much focusing always on Ellsberg paradox, and many papers, they only speak about ambiguity aversion, and to give away the plot of the story maybe, there's more than risk aversion, also risky, and with ambiguity the same. I think at this moment, the ambiguity field is quite like risk was in the 1980s. Also, there's too many models. There are many ambiguity models nowadays, and that's a bit of a problem. If a practitioner says, okay, I'm convinced I want to use these new models. Well, there are 15 models to choose from. Which should I choose? It's a bit, well, we have to go through it, and biologists, we learn from biology, it's a natural process, but time and competition should come so that we can see what are the good models, and time will teach. So in that sense, again, we can learn from history. Well, let me continue a bit on the idea to use probability weighting to get non-EU models. There was a paper by Honda in 1977, Journal of Political Economy, that used this idea of probability weighting. And there was also, may I call it a paper, in Econometrica that also used the idea of probability weighting. And these papers had in common, by Kahneman and Tversky. Maybe Daniel told about the photo where Amos Tversky looks like a naughty boy, that maybe he had that photo in mind. Amos at young age and looking like a naughty boy indeed. Anyway, these papers had in common, they were appearing in prominent economic journals. And then something in the psychology journals, but economic journal, the economists, they are more theoretically oriented than psychologists. So when especially the Honda paper, the first of these two, when it appeared, there were many economists looking at it and many economists reacting, and they noticed that you can't have this. This formula is violating stochastic dominance, but in a way that also empirically cannot be. So the journal received 10 letters that commented, look, hey, this model cannot be, it's violating stochastic dominance. In a short time they published maybe the best mathematician, Peter Fishburne, they published his letter on it. There was the Australian undergraduate student, John Quiggin, who also sent such a letter. His letter was not published. Well, that was the problem with Honda, and Kahneman, Tversky, by the way, they have no lack of interest. The second most cited paper in the economic journal. But basically they had the same problem as Honda. They tried to fix a bit, but not very nicely. The same basic problem they had. So they all violate stochastic dominance, as we know, and many models of that kind had the same problem. And when economists look at this thing, they immediately see it. So then in those days it came out. You can say it's a bit, our field is quite psychology and economics mixing. It is amazing that such a model could exist in the psychological literature for 30 years and people did not notice the problems, that it does not work well. So here, I'm in the middle of the history and how people, this problem, now the fix will come, of course, Quiggin's fix. This was a step in history that really had to come from economists, people with theoretical understanding, theoretical depth who can handle these things. So Quiggin, he fixed the problem, and I will not give the formula. In this time of the day in Europe, at least, formulas don't work anymore. And I think also many people know how Quiggin fixed it. Quiggin found the right formula, A right, in many respects, is the natural way to do it. to get this intuition that psychologists had from the beginning, we have to do something, a model that does something with probabilities. They didn't know how to do it. Quiggin was the first to find it. Several economists in those days independently also found it, but now generally people say Quiggin was the first. So John has the priority on it. Okay, so that was a bit about general way to model risk attitude. Now with history, let me go on which phenomena do we want to incorporate? How about risk aversion, deviation from it? And economists' views were always, they assumed universal risk aversion, already an expected utility. And then if you look only at the LA paradox, that tells you that you want to generalize expected utility in the direction of adding extra risk aversion of a kind that expected utility cannot handle. So this quite for a long time, economists were really focused on risk aversion. And the first decade almost that people wrote on rank-dependent utility probability weighting, the economic papers were always assuming risk aversion means concave utility. It also means that the weighting function is risk averse. That's like convex. So that was the almost universally assumed thing that people were working on. And here again, there was a disconnect between the many theoretical papers and empirical papers, because empirical papers, they find different things. And to get the right shapes, the right phenomena, that's really where psychologists are better. And here the field needed inputs from psychologists to come. And that came from Kahneman and Tversky, because they had the right phenomena. They combined the theoretical insight of John Quiggin with their understanding of empirical phenomena. And they showed that we have too much risk seeking to ignore it. If we do descriptive work, we must incorporate it. We have this fourfold pattern, for small probability, large gain, people are risk seeking usually. And for losses, moderate, large probabilities, they are more risk seeking than risk averse. So Kahneman and Tversky, they also brought in other things that they don't talk about, reference dependent, sign dependent, loss aversion. We need those things. Any empirical theory will have to incorporate these things. So this is the prevailing probability weighting function. It is not just that risk averse, it's the inverse S shape. And that was an input that had to come from psychologists. And here you can say it is not good maybe in economics that there was this disconnect since the 1940s till the 1970s or so between the empirical theoretical people and the empirical people. That economists were a long time assuming universal risk aversion, but every empirical study shows the opposite. We need to study different phenomena. And that was where Kahneman and Tversky came in. So that led to a synthesis for decision under risk that was captured, Tversky Kahneman 92. They combined the theoretical insights of Quiggin with the empirical insights that they had themselves, people from their field. And what is so exceptional about prospect theory, it is both theoretically and empirically, it works well. So that was what only they could do. And maybe specialists in ambiguity can recognize similar things going on in ambiguity. Also in ambiguity, the prevailing empirical finding is a fourfold pattern, quite like risk. If you change gains into losses or likely events into unlikely events, things flip. You have a four combinations. That's the prevailing empirical pattern. We need to find models that handle it. A little bit of that has already happened. But let me summarize now where risk is nowadays. In the 92, after that, there haven't been very many developments in risk theory. There has this, this adaptive radiation, but now many models have disappeared more or less. Nowadays in risk, there is expected utility if you want to have it simple or you want to do normative. There's a prospect theory for empirical purposes. And quite some people still cite the disappointment aversion model for a goal. This very nice model, but often they do it only for 2 outcome lotteries. And then it is in fact a sub-case of prospect theory. And not the most interesting one because it cannot handle the fourfold pattern. So the risk theory now is quite converged to these models. And for ambiguity, that is still to happen and only time will tell. Although there's already, if I may end my lecture with a few words on ambiguity, Tversky Kahneman 92, many people are not well aware of it maybe, but they already proposed immediately a model for ambiguity. They immediately proposed the theoretic insights, then not Quiggin, but theoretic insight that Gilbert-Schmeiter had put forward. they combined it with their empirical insight of loss aversion and all these things. And they already had a good ambiguity theory, which is my favorite, but I'm maybe not objective, and time will tell. So then this is where I want to end. And I think even now there is some minutes left where people can ask questions. So I would quite like if people unmute themselves and ask questions.